If you think Christmas is all lights and laughter, wait until you hear what came knocking in the ceiling. These are 13 accounts people sent in. Ordinary homes, ordinary families, where the season's warmth bent, then cracked. Not movies, not thrill-seeking fabrications, just voices on the other end of a line. The smell of something metallic in the hall. A dog freezing mid-bark. Keep that in mind as you listen. If you like this, consider subscribing for more late-night terrors. This one started with 3 knocks. A listener who moved into a cheap, older house just before December remembered the way the place felt empty in the daytime. Echoing footsteps, long curtains that barely moved even with the heater on. The first Christmas morning, they woke to a steady, patient pattern. 3 soft raps from somewhere above the bedroom. The sort of precise, domestic rhythm you'd expect from a neighbor testing a pipe. They were alone that winter. Packing boxes sat like little islands of paper and tape. The knocks came again, closer this time, directly over the bed. The dog, a mutt with a loud alarm bark, had been curled at the foot of the mattress and did not stir. I thought maybe it was raccoons, the sender wrote, or the heat, or the house settling. But the sounds were exactly like someone tapping a knuckle 3 times. They climbed out of bed and listened by the door. The air felt thin, cold, but not the winter you pinch off from a window. It was a quiet cold, the kind that doesn't bite so much as take a breath away. The knocks repeated, patient. The listener opened the door into the hallway. Nothing. No stairs creaked, no attic hatch slammed. The dog followed, head cocked, and when the last knock came, it seemed to originate from the ceiling fixture itself, an old, cheap chandelier that ticked faintly when it cooled. They climbed the ladder to the attic later, flashlight in hand, and found nothing more than boxes and an old string of tree lights. The lights were unplugged. The dust lay undisturbed save for a single, tiny indentation on the plywood, an imprint like a fingertip. Too small for a raccoon, too precise to be a settling joist. For weeks after, the knocks returned on quiet mornings and late afternoons. 3 measured taps. Once the listener sat up with the dog at their feet and heard the pattern come again, only this time it was answered in the room below by the sound of something small like a spoon tapping back. The answer came from the kitchen, empty but for the nightstand where the listener's grandmother's bell sat. They found the bell on the counter when they entered, tiny and warm to the touch as if someone had just rung it. The warmth on the porcelain was the strangest thing. It wasn't steam, it felt like the heat from a palm. The dog wouldn't go into the kitchen after that for a week, and the knocks never happened when the listener had company.
It's like the house remembers the morning someone used to live here, as if it can still be Chelsea's house, they wrote. Chelsea being the previous occupant, whose obituary the listener had read online, the one who had died on a cold December, alone. If the pattern sounds nostalgic, it's because it was almost tender. The knocking always began where a person would have stood. It would tap 3 times, quiet and deliberate, and then fade like someone acknowledging they had been heard and had somewhere else to go. The last time the listener heard 3 knocks, the dog, who had been unnaturally calm for days, lifted his head and growled, low, surprised. When the listener opened the bedroom door, the hallway was flooded with light from an outside street lamp. The bell lay under the table, back in place. Nothing else moved. But in the dust on the windowsill, there were 3 tiny round marks, like someone had pressed thumbs there, and then left. They left the house the following January, and the small indentation in the attic boards was the only physical thing they'd ever find that seemed to confirm the noises. When they called the estate agent to ask about Chelsea, they were told nobody checked the attic during the showing. It was always empty, the agent said. You must have put that bell up there yourself. The listener didn't answer. There was a pause between that story and the next one the listener sent, a silence the narrator could almost hear in the text, a kind of respectful, unsettled hush. The holidays, as anyone will tell you, have a way of letting the past come through like breath on glass. 2. She thought it was her grandmother, until the tree fell. A family tapped a specific glass bell ornament that had belonged to the mother's mother. It was chipped at the rim and tarnished around the clapper, but everyone fought over who would hang it every year. The son, now a teenager, wrote in to say that the house had become quieter since the grandmother passed. The first Christmas without her, the family strung lights, loaded the tree with ornaments, and sat around drinking bad holiday punch because that's what you do. Around midnight, the teenage boy woke to the sound of a very faint bell threading itself through the silence of the living room. He padded downstairs in socks and found the living room lit only by the tree. The bell ornament dusted its own branch gently, turning in a way that made no sound on the needles. The boy reached to lift it, feeling the exact shape of the old woman's hand in the grooves of porcelain, and thought, without irony, that she must have come by to hang it herself. He set it back and stepped away because there are boundaries you keep even with the dead. Then minutes later, the tree lurched as though shoved. Ornaments shattered on the carpet with the crystalline rain. The stand scraped along the hardwood like a thing waking up. The teenager shoved the tree back into the stand. It wobbled and held.
He didn't tell his parents because there was the shape of grief in their faces already, and he didn't want to add to it with something they might think he'd imagined. For the next 3 years, the bell would sometimes ring in the empty house, a single soft chime in the hour after midnight. Dogs would look pointedly at the mantel and then go back to sleep. The teenage boy, now older, learned a little about the family that the ornament had never told him, how his grandmother had been the living room steward, how she had sat in the same chair every evening and listened to the radio. He began to tell himself these were comforting visitations, a grandmother checking in. Then, at the 4th Christmas after her death, the living room filled with the smell of cigarette smoke, odd because nobody in the family smoked anymore. The bell rang and the tree crashed, this time not as if pushed, but as if something had grown inside it, swollen and violent. The TV couch's cushions were skewed as if someone had been sitting there and had stood up too fast. More than that, the framed photograph of the grandmother, an old black and white portrait, hung crooked, the bottom edge shoved out from the wall by about an inch. The boy saw, tilting in the frame, the faint fingerprint of a hand across the glass, smudged, but too high for the grandmother's reach in life. After that year, the family boxed the bell and put it on the top shelf of the hall closet. They still heard the ringing sometimes in the middle of the night, but it was always distant, as if the sound had to pass through layers of stuff she might no longer penetrate. One Christmas, a visiting uncle opened that closet to find the bell exactly where it had been placed, safe and still, while the family dog sat at the closet door whining as if someone outside had banged a chain. The boy realized he could no longer parse whether the bell comforted them or tested them. This one sits on the cusp between tender and dangerous. It asks whether memory can be both warm and a shove at your ribs. 3. They heard a voice that stopped the dog mid-bark. A couple who lived in a ranch house with 2 mutts told us about a shift in the soundscape of their holiday. The woman had stopped going to church after work and cared mostly for her mother, who had dementia. One December evening, she was binging a cheesy holiday movie and laughing at the bad acting while a storm thrashed the gutters. The dogs played at her feet, and every so often one would bark at the bushes, at the storm, at nothing at all. Then, plainly over the soundtrack of canned violin, a human voice spoke a name, soft, precise, the kind of small, private pronunciation a family member uses across a kitchen table. The sound swallowed the dog's next barks. Both animals froze, ears pricked, heads cocked toward the kitchen door. The woman's mother was asleep in the back room and had not moved. The voice didn't come from the TV. It didn't come from any of the rooms.
It said the grandmother's childhood nickname in a way that made the mother in the house stop breathing. She told us, it said Maggie, the way my mom's brother used to call her. It said it like he was there, like the house had learned how he sounded. She stood and went to the kitchen, heart thrumming oddly, and found the sink full of syrupy water left over from an earlier attempt to make sticky buns. The radio was in the bedroom and had not been turned on. When she returned, one of the dogs had a low, hackling growl in its throat, and the other would not move from the threshold, nose high in the air. They started recording their nights after that. The voice never appeared on the files. The audio picked up small interruptions, the creak of floorboards, the soft rustle of the rain, but never a human syllable. The mother in the house began to leave a chair cushion slightly pulled toward the kitchen in case someone arrived and wanted to sit. Like an offering, she wrote, as if you set a cup down to be polite. The dogs refused to stay in the kitchen at night. Once the woman woke early to the smell of frying oil in the air, as if breakfast were already cooking. She walked into the dark hallway and found a streak of grease on the counter, like the one you smear when you lift a pan by its handle. No pan was on the stove. She felt watched, and not in the hateful sense, watched the way one watches a child walk on a busy street, vigilantly. These kinds of voices, the family insisted, weren't malicious so much as intimate. They had the contours of memory. But intimacy, when uninvited, becomes something else. The unseen speaker knew names. The unseen speaker could still call for someone at the wrong time. The dog's reaction was the damning detail, 2 animals trained to ignore trick noises, frozen as if the world itself had been cued to stop. The family moved the mother into assisted care the next year, tired of distinguishing between loneliness and haunting. They still keep a recording device on the mantel during holidays. When played back in daylight, the tapes have the storm, the good movie dialogue, and the scrape of the chair leg, never the voice that once made the dog stop mid-bark. But the house kept on speaking to those who would listen. Between stories, the narrator lets the listener breathe, A sentence like a hand laid flat across a pale table. The holidays are when small things remember how to get loud. 4. A shadow that reenacted a porch routine. An elderly man who did not sleep much wrote in regarding the night he saw the hooded shape on his porch. He'd been a light sleeper his whole life, the kind of person who gets up to check a window at 1 in the morning and then goes back to bed with a mug of tepid coffee. The porch light was the kind that cast a long, narrow pool of stain across the plants. One Christmas Eve, he sat on the couch near the window knitting while a neighbor's car alarm chimed in the distance.
He watched the porch because it was a small, ordinary kindness he could do. Observe his own little property. On the 4th hour after midnight, he noticed a darkening at the edge of the light. At first, he thought a cat had stretched itself into the shadow, but the form was too stiff, too deliberate. It lingered by the railing, then moved, always mimicking a particular human motion. A hand lifting to rub a cheek, a slight stoop like someone checking a mailbox, the motion repeated like someone practicing an old habit. He opened his front door enough to let the winter air in and called out, "Hey!" Nothing. The shape retreated, not by walking, but by unfurling, as if it were the shadow of someone who had once been alive and had kept practicing their porch routine in the after hours. Neighbors sometimes passed by at odd times and saw nothing. The man's dog, an old terrier who had been his companion since his wife's death, barked once and then refused to go near the door for a week. He'd been a stoic old thing all his life, the writer said. Then he wouldn't cross the threshold, wouldn't go on the porch for days. The man began leaving a small plate of food outside each night for a creature that may not have wanted it. Sometimes the plate would be nudged. Once the chain to the porch light was found sitting draped across the railing, with no way someone could have dropped it there. There were also nights when the porch seemed to hold a scraped sound, like someone moving a letter across a mailbox's flap. The image wasn't frightening at first. It was simply lonely. But then other things started to happen. The next-door neighbor's car alarm would ring at precisely the same time as the porch shadow's routine. Small footprints, thrice marked in frost on the woodwork that did not match any shoe. And once, weeks later, the man found a child's mitten on the bottom stair, a mitten he had never had in his household. It was dry and smelled faintly of smoke. A figure that copies habit is unnerving, because habit implies an origin. If it's mimicking a living memory, who is it remembering? The man thought perhaps the porch had been a stage for many lives, and the shadow had chosen one habit to replay. But the dog seemed to understand more than the man did. The terrier's growl sometimes resumed when the living room chair was empty, as if the dog also saw the shadow in the periphery and was keeping watch where its owner could not. 5. A TV couch visitor with no feet. This one begins in a crowded apartment on the 22nd of December. A roommate group had thrown up a cheap tree in the living room and were away at a midnight pizza run when the youngest renter, a woman working nights at a hospital, came home to find the living room couch disordered.
Cushions shifted, a blanket dragged to the floor, a single ghostly impression on the couch as if someone had been sitting with their feet tucked under them. But the rug by the coffee table showed no corresponding footprints. She said she had woken to the sensation of being watched and followed the instinct every worker in a night shift develops: turn on all the lights. That's when the couch's back had an indentation that looked recent. The impression was of a person sitting, slumped, one shoulder higher than the other. The television was off, and the remote lay on the furthest cushion, 3 feet away as if it had slid. She later told friends she felt the weight linger in the fabrics, a pressure that agreed with the shape of someone breathing unevenly. She sat where she thought the visitor had been, and the weight on the cushions pulled at her memory like a physical thing. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table with a text from one of the roommates. "Who's home?" She didn't respond. Dogs in the apartment complex, a neighbor's German shepherd, howled once into the night as if in conversation. Then the woman heard something clear and impossible through the thin walls, the sound of someone walking across a wooden floor in the apartment above, though the building's upper unit had been vacant for months. The hall outside recorded the scrape of a shoe against wood. Nothing matched. When her roommates returned, none of them believed in ghosts, except in the offhand way people believe in drafts. They joked, made coffee. Later, as they sat on the couch, one of them noticed the imprint again, and the air in the room went cold like a used refrigerator. They looked at one another. The pressure seemed to sigh under the upholstery and release, like someone exhaling after they had been listened to. They never saw the visitor directly. The imprint remained for hours sometimes, and on other nights it simply wasn't there. The young woman switched apartments a year later, but kept the memory ingrained. A living room presence with no visible way to leave the room, no feet on the floor, a strange propriety in how it took up space like it belonged there.
6. Pictures turned upside down. A listener described an old farmhouse where family photos had a way of moving when nobody else was around. Photos that had hung in straight rows would be found askew, then the following day reversed entirely, faces turned toward the wall. The house had once been large and boisterous in the summers, with picnics and a swing. By Christmas it was skeletal, a single bulb over the table, a child away at school, a father working overtime. The first incident came after dinner when the family sat down to a holiday movie. A picture they all recognized, a wedding photo with grainy smiles, was found hanging upside down at dawn. The mother assumed a child had woken and played a prank, but the child's room door had been locked all night.
The house had an old cat named Sam who would sit on the windowsill and watch the lane. Sam began behaving oddly. He would hiss at corners and poke his head into rooms as if checking for a particular occupant. Once, the mother swore she saw him leap and stare at the wall where a portrait had been reversed. He pawed at the wood with single stubborn swipes until his claws scraped clean marks. The marks were there the next morning, white in the lacquer. The family tried to control it. They nailed frames tighter, they moved the photos to the closet, they took the frames down and placed them on the table. Still, occasionally a photograph would be found turned face down on the hallway runner. A few times, the frames were not just upside down, but slid to the edge of a shelf, perilously balanced, as if someone had come very close to thumping them to the floor and thought better of it. Neighbors conjectured about rodents, about vibrations from the road, but the photographs themselves recorded nothing. The flips had no fingerprints, no evidence of how they had moved. The mother began sleeping with a light on in the kitchen, and when the house finally felt still at 3 a.m, she would hear a faint scuff from the hall, like someone dragging a slipper, a small sound that might have been a person walking away. The thing that made the family start to dread the photographs was not the motion itself, but what would sometimes happen the morning after. The air would taste metallic for a few seconds, as if someone had opened a tin of paint. Once, after a picture had been upside down for 3 nights, the cat vanished for a day and returned with fur ruffled, tail low, and would not cross the threshold of the room where the photographs hung. The family decided, reluctantly, to take a vacation that Christmas to try to outrun the small domestic misalignments. The photos remained when they returned. 7. The man in the parking aisle who looked like everyone you'd rather not meet. Not all Christmas horror requires dust and candles. Some of it is cold fluorescent light in a Target parking lot. A woman wrote of a late-night run for stocking stuffers. The parking lot was mostly empty, the security lights throwing hard halos. She was almost to the big sliding glass doors when she saw a man standing by a cart return bay, a small figure hunched into a coat, hands in pockets, breathing slow. She felt the fundamental human index of unease, not the presence of an immediate threat, but the feeling that this person did not belong in any of the usual ways. His clothes were out of season, his eyes too still. She hurried past, shoulders tight, pretended not to look. When she came out of the store, bag in hand, the man was closer to her car, not within attacking range, nothing choreographed, but close enough to force her to cross the lot to get to her keys. She told herself not to be paranoid. But the man moved with a steady economy, as if measuring whether she would grow alarmed. She found that when she locked her car and drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into the same pattern she had been in, as if he had memorized her trajectory and followed the pause between steps. Over the next few weeks, the woman saw him in different places, standing at a bus stop, sitting on the bench in the laundromat for a single, still hour, far too late at night. Once she spotted him across a grocery lane as she pushed a cart. He made a movement like he was adjusting his coat when she passed, and for a second she glimpsed the hollow at his temple where hair had once been. She reported him to the store security once when he kept showing in the camera footage as a tight, stationary shape. People moved around him like islands. The footage showed a man, then a sudden gap where he had been, and then a town luxury of slow pans returns. At Christmas, after a neighborhood candlelight vigil, the woman saw the man by the cemetery gate. He stood there in the fog of car lights, as if waiting for someone to return. She walked the other way. A week later, she attended a friend's funeral and saw a man in a dark coat slip into the back pew and not leave until the end. The friend who had arranged the service later told her the video of the funeral recorded an extra person in the pews who didn't show on any of the guest lists. When staff checked the footage, they said the angle suggested the pew was empty. It was as if he had been afforded the space of a person, but not the occupancy. The woman began to dream of him. In the dreams, he never spoke, he simply watched.
and sometimes he made a motion like putting something small on a shelf and then walking away. She described coming downstairs one morning to find a single cheap plastic ornament on the mantel, one she had never owned, and no one else in the house had either. The ornament was dry and cold and smelled faintly of dust and exhaust. She smashed it to pieces on the step because she couldn't stand the idea of it being anything other than inanimate. He stopped appearing, she said, for a while. Then, on a winter night when the streets were slippery and the wind sounded like someone whispering through a grate, she received a text from an unknown number, a single emoji of a bell. She didn't reply. The man in the parking lot plays on the fear that some strangers are less human than they appear. He is not an animate poltergeist so much as a shape that fits into spaces where normal people go, filling them with the wrong kind of attention. The interlude between stories is short, a crack like an ornament being set back on a shelf. Sometimes the worst thing isn't what comes in through the door, but what learns your routes and waits politely at the edges. 8. A child's laughter that escalated. A house full of holiday chaos turned genuinely dangerous in one listener's report.
They were living with 2 small children and a new tree in the corner of the playroom, with ornaments unsafely within reach. One December evening, the parents were busy assembling Swedish meatballs and arguing about whether to call Aunt June when the kids went quiet, a silence parents know both as warning and relief. The mother found the toddler sitting on the rug, eyes fixed on the tree, smiling at something only the child could see. The child laughed, a high, breathy laugh, and said, "He wants my truck." The mother peered under the tree and saw nothing but a shadow between the wrapped boxes and the tree skirt. She asked gently, "Who do you see?" The child pointed up at the garland and named a man the parents had never heard of. For the next week, small things began to happen. The favorite truck of the toddler would be misplaced and then returned, but with a smear on its plastic wheel, like the trace of thumb with something oily on it. A stocking would be pulled open and a single item removed, only to be left later on the pillow. The older sibling came down one morning crying because toys had been thrown across the room, blocks scattered as if a wind had moved through, though windows were closed and there was no breeze. A favorite book lay open to a page the children hadn't reached yet, as if someone had read it and then set it down. At first the parents tried to frame it as mischief. Children play, children hide things. But one night the laughter changed. It wasn't the delighted tinkling sound of a child playing alone. It was layered, a sharp little echo overlaying the child's own voice that made the mother look up. The house felt full of an unaccountable smallness, a repetition like someone overdubbing a recording. The dog, who usually played with the kids, refused to go into the playroom and walked around it in wary circles. The mother caught the toddler once standing in the middle of the room, staring at the ceiling, smiling at a spot only visible to him, hands clasped like a person waiting. "He's making my truck go," the child said, pointing. "He's singing." The mother felt something cold press at the back of her neck, a breath not on her skin, but in the air between their heads. She had the sudden, solid fear that the child would learn to imitate this thing's laughter on purpose. One afternoon, as relatives piled in for a holiday meal, a glass bowl of cranberry sauce slid off the table and shattered where no hand had been visible. The baby started to laugh then, a laugh too sharp and too many-voiced for a single small throat. The family's elderly aunt, visiting from another state, laughed too, then stopped, her face straining, because she had also heard the extra voice layered behind the child's. It sounded like children singing along together, she said later, voice low. The mother began to dread bedtime, which had always been the children's sanctuary.
The thing had learned to sound like them, to echo them back, until the house was full of doubled childhood. When she recorded a night just to be sure, because you do that now, and what you capture often isn't what you expect, the playback had the child's small breaths, and then, after a pause, another breath right on top, as if 2 bodies occupied the same small shoulders. They called a family friend, half joking, half terrified, who spoke of old notions, that some spirits linger because they need to be seen by children. The parents tried to ban the topic from the house. The child continued to laugh in the corners. Toys were found hurled not in play, but in sudden violence, as if someone else had suddenly been at play and then had grown tired. This story tilts toward a fear that feels like betrayal, tiny, trusted bodies becoming the conduits of something else. It is at this point, with the children's small voices echoing and the dog refusing to cross a line, that the night stretches out long. The narrator closes this section quietly, letting the hum of the season thicken. Outside, the wind presses its cold palm against the world. 9. A snow house light that blinked by itself. A listener living in a small town where Christmas lights were taken seriously wrote about a row of fake window candles some families set in their windows to mimic warmth. Their neighbor's plastic snow house, the kind that lights up from inside and sits on the front stoop, had been unplugged and stored away the previous spring.
The neighbor, whose hands were arthritic, always set the little display on the porch each year with care. One night, the listener noticed that the snow house light was glowing despite the switch off and the extension cord coiled and stored. The glow was weak at first, like a flashlight under a bedsheet, then brightened to mimic the warm fake flame you'd buy at a craft store. They thought maybe the neighbor had forgotten to turn it off, or there'd been a power leak. When they went to check, the porch was empty, the neighboring houses dark, and the snow house's tiny windows pulsed as if someone were breathing inside. The dog accompanying them, an old lab who loved routine, sat at the top step and refused to move forward. His eyes tracked an invisible thing across the porch, and he whimpered, a low, small sound. The listener felt a cold come through the stoop and heard a soft clicking from within the plastic house, like the mechanical innards of a toy trying to catch a non-existent current. They picked up the snow house and found no batteries. When they took it inside and placed it on the table for the morning, the light remained dim for an hour and then went out. That night it glowed again on the porch all by itself. Neighbors later admitted to seeing the same glow, but each described it differently. A wink, a steady lamplight, a flicker like a moth in heat. Nothing else was out of the ordinary. No footsteps in the street, no sign that anyone had been by.
The snow house became a small private beacon across the block. People would catch sight of it as they passed and feel the immediate, misplaced comfort of a borrowed hearth. The listener began to dread the tiny blinking. It felt as if someone was trying to indicate their presence without speaking, the light being the slowest way to knock on a door. Once in a while, a second tiny reflection would appear in the snow house's window, a shape that did not belong to any of the neighbors. It did not look like a person so much as the suggestion of a face pressed behind frosted glass. 10. An attic bell that tolled only at midnight. A man who had recently converted an old attic into a simple guest room wrote about a single wooden bell he had found in a box of his grandmother's things. It was a small, hand-painted bell with a faded robin's egg color and a ribbon frayed at the knot. He hung it by the attic door as a sort of ornament. He would wake sometimes to the faint sound of its clapper touching, as if the ribbon had brushed a wall in the night. One midnight in December, alone and awake because of exam cram for a child at home, he heard it ring the way a church bell rings once for a death, a hollow, singular toll that travels the spine. It was not the gentle chiming of the ornament, but the exact mathematical dunk of a bell calling out a boundary. He went up the ladder to check and found the little bell swaying lightly as if someone had just walked by. The attic was cold in an unusual way, the kind of cold that reached past the clothes to the bones. He took the bell down and held it. The wood was warm in patches, as if someone had been holding it recently and had let go. There was a smear of something on the ribbon, something that smelled faintly of old paper and oddly cedar. The ribbon had small flecks that might have been ash. He said he was tempted to tell his mother about it, but he didn't want to fill her with questions she could not bear in her own grief. The bell rang again the next night at exactly midnight, and then again at the same time on the night after. Each time the bell made the house feel smaller, as if a door within it had been opened and then quickly shut. He put the bell in a drawer and wrapped it. He unwrapped it when he felt brave, and each time he did, he felt the soft impression of a hand at the back of the bell's curve, like the memory of someone who had once held it in their lap as snow fell outside. A photograph of his grandmother was found later in the attic, tucked behind a trunk, with the back torn in a way that suggested it had been removed hurriedly. He could not tell if the photograph had been moved by human hands or by something else that preferred to work at night. The bell kept ringing at midnight until the family moved the trunk from the room, after which the sound stopped for a month, and then began again on the coldest December night of all.
At this point, the narratives have multiplied enough that the listener might place a small comfort in patterns, but patterns can be reassuring only for so long. The house is a mouth that keeps returning to the same set of syllables. 11. A hooded watcher at the cemetery. A reader who did cleanup detail for a municipal cemetery during winter told us about the one time he encountered a person who seemed not to be a person. They were clearing leaves near a family plot when he saw a figure standing between two stones, a slender, hooded silhouette hunched as if leaning into a wind that didn't exist. The cemetery was one of those flattened places, trees bare, grass brown and brittle, the concrete paths slick under a light dusting of snow. He called out because etiquette in deserted public spaces requires you to speak to anyone you encounter. The figure did not turn. He moved toward the path and found himself walking beside a space that had no footprints in the light snow behind it.
When he looked at the figure's head, there was only a suggestion of a face, a hollow deep as a cave, with a kind of pinpoint darkness where the features should have been. He reported it to a coworker and said the figure stood there like an expectation. It watched the headstones like someone who had memorized the names, he wrote. The shape was not menacing. It was merely present, as if someone had taken up a duty to observe. Weeks later, the same crew excavated a grave for a scheduled interment and found disturbed earth around an older plot. The ground had been trampled in a way that suggested many small footsteps moving in a circle. The foreman swore he found a small hood-sized depression in the snow that had no corresponding human prints leading away from it. The writer returned to the cemetery one night on his own because the image had stuck to him like a burr. He brought a thermos and sat in his truck watching. The hooded figure appeared again, or perhaps it had never left, and stood by the stone of a child who had died decades ago. It raised a hand, slow and measured, and traced the edge of the name on the tombstone as if reading. He tried to take a picture and found the battery in his camera dead. The phone he used had a low signal and recorded only a faint static when he played it back. The figure remained in the memory of his eyes, an absence shaped like a person, his hood a shadow that held no interior light. A month later, the writer learned that the headstone the figure had been watching had been scheduled for replacement because the lettering had been worn by weather and time. The family asked that the old stone be preserved. When the cemetery crew came to retrieve it, they found a small stack of children's toys placed neatly beside the stone. Plastic trinkets no one in the town recognized, clean and dry despite the snow. No one claimed them. The hooded watcher suggests that some presences take on the role of guardians, but guardians of what? The dead?
The memory? Or simply the ritual of watching that humans no longer perform as faithfully as they once did? A thin breath of winter passes between this and the next account, as if the world is paring its coat. At this point, the night is long. The narrator's voice has lowered. The stories have already shifted from the mildly odd to the stubbornly uncanny. Houses rearrange their atmospheres. Dogs refuse to cross thresholds. Small lights blink where none should. Yet there is an ache to keep going. Another story waits, one that was meant to close a chapter and open another. The listener leans in, because once you have let shadows in with your ordinary holiday, you find it harder to pretend they don't exist. But just then, the world tilts again. A sound, and the sequence shifts into something harsher, less polite, less nostalgic. Our next account comes from a listener who never meant to host anything more than holiday cheer. 12. He thought the leak was from old pipes, until the house began to bleed. A man who'd grown up with basements that smelled of detergent and old Christmas boxes wrote in about the December when his family decided to finally finish the renovation and sleep in the upstairs rooms through the holidays. They'd moved the tree into the corner, above the finished part, put the string of cheap icicle lights up along the eaves, and wrapped the banister in garlands. The house had that low, honest hum of people getting ready, pies cooling on racks, a toddler's mitten left on the armchair like a small accusing flag. One morning in the first week of December, he went downstairs to fetch last year's extension cords and found a dark, slow spot spreading along the seam of the basement ceiling. It wasn't a spill like you'd expect from a pipe burst. The liquid threaded itself along the plaster joint, collecting at the drywall seam, and then beating into droplets that fell at regular intervals. Drop, pause, drop. Where each bead hit the concrete, it left a faint rusty smear, thin as a fingernail streak. He called his brother, and they crawled into the low-lit crawl space with flashlights, and a flashlight's worth of bravado. There was no leak in the plumbing. The pipes above were dry and copper bright. The furnace was fine. Even the electrician, who showed up more annoyed than worried, shrugged and said there was nothing mechanical to explain the pattern. Must be condensation, he offered, because people like to offer something plausible. But the smell was wrong. It was not the mildew tang of damp basements. It had a metallic edge that seemed to sit just behind the nose, like a memory of pennies handled too long. The dog, Sam, an old mutt who knew the house better than most people, whined and put his head to the spot where the droplets landed without touching them. He refused to go into the basement for 3 days. Each night the droplets lengthened their path.
A line, thin as if traced by a tentative hand, curved down the stairs beneath the furnace and stopped at the old storage door. Once they pulled the door open, the light speared a new trail, a wet, darkened smear leading from the threshold across the concrete and pooling in the corner, where the family stored boxes labeled Christmas lights, garland, ornaments. The pool wasn't deep, but the floor had the sheen of something that had been there for a while and was drying. The boxes near it were damp at the bottom, as if someone had set them too near to a spill. He called the landlord, who was more skeptical than alarmed. The landlord sent a man who'd worked in storage units and old houses his whole life. The man knelt by the stain, put a gloved finger near it, smelled, and then said nothing for a long time. He left without offering an explanation that satisfied anyone. After that, small things escalated. Ornaments in the living room rolled from their branches to the floor with a soft urgency, as if gravity itself had a preference. A string of lights that had been carefully coiled on the workbench, unplugged, tagged, and boxed, was found draped over the furnace, where the warmth made the plastic soft. One evening, the family woke to the sound of glass cracking in the living room. An old picture frame had split down the middle along the mat. When they lifted the frame, the photograph inside, a holiday snapshot, had a thin smear across its white border, the sort of mark you'd get if someone had dragged a gloved thumb across wet paint. The family wouldn't say the word, but everyone recognized the smell in the margins of memory, the same metallic note that had introduced itself in the basement. People speculate in odd ways when they want to be safe. They called a contractor to check for old nails. He found none. They brought in a plumber again. The second plumber touched the stain and sucked the breath back down his throat. He wouldn't go on record, but the son said the man muttered something about rust and old dye, which is to say words that only try to wrap what they saw in neutral terms. He refused to go under the stairs alone after that. One night, when the house felt as still as closed eyes, the family sat watching a movie and heard a small, distant sound, a rattle, like someone turning a key in a lock far away. The toddler, crawling on the floor, looked toward the stairwell and began to babble with that urgent happiness little ones have when discovering an animal behind a door. The father's stomach dropped. Sam flew up and bolted down the stairs, frantic, his nails scraping the wood like a tiny drum roll. He hesitated at the top of the basement and then refused to go further. When the father shone his light, he saw something that made his hand go cold. 3 small round stains on the rim of the furnace, like the exact circumference of beads that had sat there and left their white kiss. The smell surged, and with it, a sensation of being watched from below.
He shut the light and went back upstairs and slept on the sofa along with his wife for the next 2 nights. The pool in the basement evaporated a little more each dawn, but never disappeared entirely. A week later, while a relative finished strapping boxes into a donated storage unit, boxes of baby clothes, a box of the grandmother's crocheted doilies, the friend who'd driven the truck called frantic. "My unit's open," he said. "No, I locked it. Now it's just unlocked." When the man went with him at dusk, the security lights of the facility were dull and guarded by long halos. The door of the unit was shut, but not in the dark, old way of wind and wood. It had been drawn and somehow latched in a way that suggested someone had been inside and left without closing the metal shutter properly. They walked in. The boxes were the same ones they'd left, labeled, taped, but one lay open and the ornaments inside were strewn across the concrete as if someone had taken a handful and thrown them lightly forward. There was no sign of forced entry. A single strand of tinsel lay coiled into a small, obsessive spiral. Then the light from the truck's overhead lamp caught something at the back, a thin streak running like a river across the floor toward the drain. It was darker than the shadow and glittered a little in the sodium light. The friend swore he felt the metal taste in his mouth just looking at it. No one wanted to touch it. They called the storage manager, who shrugged and said the facilities occasionally had condensation problems in winter. But when they looked closer, they found that the streak didn't run like water. Its edges were soft, almost like something had seeped and cooled. The manager, who'd seen a lot and preferred to keep his own counsel, told them to take the boxes and leave the unit closed. "Some things you don't bring home," he said, and they felt the words like a warning, not instruction. That night, the house did something that made the father stop pretending there would be a simple answer. The Christmas tree, tied to the stand and weighted down with sandbags in the basement salvaged way people anchor trees when children play with them, tipped. Not slowly, not like a tree that gives because someone knocks it. It lurched as if a hand had pulled the trunk, and then someone had pushed at the top in a quick, forceful motion. Ornaments rained like tiny meteorites onto the carpet, some shattering, others spinning and stopping with their hooks bent like the claws of a creature. The metal of a bell ornament sang a note that had something of a human syllable in it, a short, vowelless sound that the daughter later described as someone saying "shh" very close. The family rushed in.
The toddler had crawled away from the tree, bewildered, clapping hands at the falling lights as if at a show. Sam shaved at the base of the tree, barking lunatically for a full minute, and then shutting up so hard the sound could have been misheard.
The father picked up a piece of glass with a gloved hand and found the edge warm, as if it had just been in someone's palm. He put it into a paper towel and carried it to the sink. When he flushed the towel into the trash, the garbage bag pulsed, like something beneath it breathing. They thought to leave. They planned to spend 13 days in a hotel and let the house sit, let whatever it was dissipate. But the house is stubborn. The night before they left, while they were packing the car, there came a slow, steady knocking from somewhere overhead. 3 deep, tired knocks, followed by a pause, and then another set. Different than the quick, precise taps from another life. This was older, as if someone were testing the ceiling for a weakness. The toddler laughed from the booster seat, because things that mimic patterns make children feel safe. The father didn't laugh. He turned, and in the puddle at the base of the basement stairs, there was now a small ring of dried crust, like a smear that had been allowed to scab. When they returned in January, the stain had all but vanished. Boxes smelled faintly of metal, but were otherwise intact. The tree stand, when they dismantled it, had fine scratches along the bolt line, as if someone, or something, had turned it from below to test the bark. They kept the picture frame with the smear, and framed it again, because sometimes there are odd talismans you retain to feel like you have answered a wrong. They never figured out the origin of the stain. They never found anyone in the storage unit footage. The friend's truck has a faint, persistent smell on the passenger seat that no conditioner has removed. Sam refuses to sleep at the foot of the stairs in winter. If you press the father on the phone now, he will say only that the house felt thirsty that December, and that the way the drops fell had been the most human thing of all, regular, patient, and impossibly deliberate. A small, exhausted silence follows this one, as if the house itself has taken a breath. But there is more to come. We saved the worst for the end, because stories gather courage from the dark, and some things only show their teeth after they've had room to move. 13. The child who laughed at the grown-ups, then moved the furniture. Our final account came from a woman who had lived her life surrounded by the noise of children and holiday dinners. Her house had the taut, crowded warmth of a family that did not bother to hide the edges. A spread of stockings, a tacky string of old lights across the bookshelf, a folding table with mismatched chairs. She'd grown used to spilt cider, to cousins arriving early and leaving late. She was used to the small, human inconveniences of family life. This December, the family was larger than usual. There were 3 extra cousins staying for the weekend, a pair of teenagers who slept through anything, and a neighbor's boy dropped off because of some grown-up obligation.
By evening, the house hummed, crock-pots simmering, laughter that rose and fell in pleasant swells, someone playing a holiday record so badly the song ran like a scratched plate. At bedtime, the youngest of the cousins, an intense little boy with a voice like a tin whistle, insisted on leaving his truck under the tree. He'd been told to do it, a small ritual. When everyone left the room, he snuck back to tidy the placement of his vehicles. Late that night, a cousin heard giggling, not the shrill, unsteady kind of an awake child's mirth, but layered laughter, as if one voice sat atop another, slightly out of time. The woman went to check, thinking to admonish. Instead, she found the boy sitting cross-legged by the tree, watching the ornaments as if they were comets. He pointed up, and in his small, fierce certainty, declared, "He's coming tonight. He likes trucks." The woman, who'd been a nurse and had learned to separate the living from the decorative in her head, smiled and kissed his hair. "Don't worry," she said. "He can look, but he can't take." That was the last time she used that voice with lightness. Over the next 48 hours, the house changed the way bread changes when left in sun. It became thin and taut and liable to snap. Toys were hurled in mid-quiet. Blocks flew from a shelf to the other side of the room with a sledding, violent arc. Chairs skittered, bumping into one another as if pushed. One evening, the Christmas tree, which had stood in the corner serene, slid a perceptible half-inch and then lurched so hard the star at the top jerked like a head turned by a sudden thought. The dog, an old lab named Bia, had last been caught mid-bark when the children filmed their own prank videos. The recording captured a sound that wasn't like bark at all, but a high, delighted trill layered over Bia's lower pitch. Later, when they slowed the footage, the laughing was doubled, and then, if the mother admits it, tripled, an impossible chorus that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The sister who slept in the room closest to the tree woke to the sensation of being touched on the sleeping bag with the quick, light pressure of small hands. She sat up and found her pillows ruffled, and a faint smear of looked like soot across her knuckles. There were other marks, a child's scuff on the wall where no paint had been scuffed before, a smear on the piano lid like the thin trace left by the end of a glove. The youngest cousin started to speak less. He would sit at the tiny kitchen table and stare at a place near the pantry, as if listening to someone telling him a joke. Then the violence picked up. One afternoon, with the older cousins playing video games and the adults distracted, a lampshade flew off its stand and struck the wall. A chair righted itself on the far side of the room with an audible thump, as if someone had pushed it.
The mother who reports the story felt a pressure behind her chest, the way you feel before crying, an animal tightening its muscles. She called the children together and tried to keep the tone light. "Ghosts at Christmas, how original," she joked, clinging to a grin like a rope. That evening, during a lull in the festivities, when a cousin had dozed on the couch and the record player had been set to a slow carol, the boy woke the household with a shout. They ran into the living room to find the tree on its side, its base sheared from the stand, as if cut in two. Ornaments lay like scattered eyes, glass polished on the carpet. The air smelled then like electrical ozone, and something else underneath it, an iron smell, not fresh but present, like having your mouth open at the dentist. The boy laughed then, an absurd, bright peal, but underneath it something else rode, a small, high cackle that didn't belong to him. The adults froze. The cousin who had filmed the earlier sounds rushed in with his phone and caught on video a shape moving behind the tinsel, fingers like the end of cotton gloves skimming the branches, a kind of buoyant motion, as if someone intangible had been practicing how to topple a tree, and then finally did. They paused the tape and played it back. There on the video, in the shimmer between bulbs, was indeed the blur of a smaller figure, no more than a suggestion, its head cocked at an impossible angle, as if watching for a reaction. The footage also showed the boy's lips moving, mouthing something in a cadence the adults couldn't hear, but felt as a pressure in the chest when they watched. He had told them many weeks earlier that someone wanted his truck. Now it seemed the someone had wanted more than toys. That night they put the boy in their bed and slept around him like a ring of vows. For a while it seemed to hold. Then, at 2 a.m, the mother woke to the sound of heady furniture scraping from the den into the hallway. A bookshelf had been shoved with the dedicated force of something that knew geometry, righting itself against the wall as a child would when playing a game, and then turning around suddenly and throwing up its shoulders in triumph. A coffee table slid and then slammed into the staircase, scattering a mug of cocoa that left a dark, radiating stain. The family recorded the night again, because now they had proof, and because sometimes humans demand the proof more loudly than we demand our own safety. On the recording you can hear the boy's breath, then another breath impossibly close, then laughter that folds in on itself like cloth. The camera's night mode registered a shift in temperature, an electronic purple bloom across the lens, where the little shape had been, and then small pockets of distortion that danced in the periphery like fireflies. They invited a friend with a metal detector to pass through the rooms the next day, just to puncture suspicion with pragmatism.
The friend joked about seeking out jewelry that the boy might have hidden. He picked up a coin from the floor near the tree and found his hands trembling as an unnoticed chill touched his palms. He set the coin down, no longer joking. The phenomenon reached its sharpest point the night before they were to send all the visiting cousins home. The adults had been cooking, and the house carried the warm, sticky smell of sugar. The mother was in the kitchen when the youngest cousin's laughter climbed the stairwell like a thing that had learned to move on its own. She ran into the living room to see, in a single, impossible instant, the sofa cushions thrown aside and the TV room cleared, as if a small, delighted hand had scooped everything from the floor up and then tossed it across the room. A chair flew from the far corner and struck the mantel with a single, clean impact. The son, who had been making a sandwich, was knocked backward by a gust of air that felt pinned and deliberate. When everything fell quiet, they looked at the tree. It was still standing, somehow upright despite the chaos, and at its center, a small ornament, one that had been in the topmost branches, rotated slowly. They approached it and recognized it, a tiny tin truck painted red, one the boy had loved. But when the mother reached up to take it, the truck was cold and dry, and had a new smear across its little hood, faint as if a mud print had been pressed there and then wiped but left the ring. They decided finally to take the boy to stay with an aunt for a week. Sometimes distance buys you space to breathe. They packed him into the car, along with a suitcase full of pajamas and a small stuffed rabbit. The boy waved at the house without looking back. He was tired and small, and capable of being handled by relatives in ways adults cannot always be. They left the lights on and asked the neighbors to keep an eye. 2 nights later, the aunt called in the early morning and said something that closed the mother's throat. While everyone had slept, the boy, sound asleep in the back room, had laughed awake, sat up, and said plainly, "He's hungry tonight." Then he'd fallen back to sleep. The aunt had reassured herself that this was a childish fantasy. She called the mother to say she'd put the child's truck near the bed in case it were a comfort.
When the mother returned to her own house 3 days later, she found the truck on top of the fireplace mantel, where she'd last left it, though she was sure she'd placed it in the child's bag. The camera they'd set up by the tree had recorded nothing of the topmost hour, just static and a low hum. But in the hours after they returned home, a neighbor sent over a video they'd taken on their doorbell camera, a tiny form darting across the living room at 1 in the morning, so fast it was nearly a smear. The file vibrated with a low frequency that the neighbor said made the dog go mad. The family watched in a kind of stunned, private horror.
On the footage, for one frame, a face appears where there should be only tinsel, small, eager, and wrong in some angle that made the skin crease at the corners. The mother keeps the footage on a hard drive under a stack of cookbooks. If you press her on it, she'd tell you, "We don't know what it wanted. There are things that like the shape of a house at Christmas, and they get greedy." She will not say the boy was possessed, because she does not want to equate her small nephew to a predator. She will say only that a space in her house learned to laugh, and that the laughter was not always the child's. The final image they gave us for the file was the one that convinced them to clear the tree the next day. They paused the tape on the living room scene, and there, in the center of the frozen frame, was an ornament swinging slowly by itself in a room otherwise perfectly still. No draft registered, no fan on, no window open. The swing tipped once, twice, and then held. At the center of the ornament's little reflection, if you could call it reflection, was the perfect tiny ring of a child's face. It smiled, and then the frame cut to black. We closed this set of 13 with a detail that should not be dismissed. The mother wrote in the last line of her account, "We kept the truck. I don't know if leaving it helped him or fed whatever it was. Sometimes at night, I leave the small bedroom light on. Sometimes I wake to find the truck on the mantel and feel both relieved and stupid. The house is quieter now, but when I go to bed, there are times I still hear a tiny laugh folded into the wind, like a child practicing delight. I answer it by telling myself stories about tire marks and children and mischief. It helps for a little while. The holidays give us many habits. We string lights to push back the dark. We place ornaments on branches to remember faces gone. Sometimes those habits are observed back. Sometimes the house practices its own rituals. And sometimes the thing that comes for your quiet is small enough to sit on your lap and patient enough to learn your name. In the thin white of the morning after the last story, there is one little unforced image we cannot shake. A single ornament swaying on an otherwise still tree, catching a light that isn't on, as if someone else had just looked away and left the room. For more stories like these, short, sharp, and guaranteed to make the next holiday feel a touch less ordinary, go to Killer Orange Cat, link in the description, where there are 3 more accounts waiting. If this one found you at the wrong hour, consider subscribing. There are more nights ahead. Thanks for listening.